The 1950s, the horror films that pretty much reflected the fear of death from above. Definitely plenty of monsters that were nuclear in origin, as we saw last week, like Godzilla and Them, and it came from beneath the sea. We also had a space age that launched in this decade, such as playing out for War of the Worlds, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Blob. But we also had some other defining highlights of the decade. And some of these highlights were films such as like Tarantula, where a spider escapes from an isolated Arizona desert laboratory that was experimenting in gigantism and grows to tremendous size as it wreaks havoc on the local inhabitants. They can't seem to stop it with bullets or dynamite. Another thing, actor Clint Eastwood, he had an uncredited minor role as a Jet Squadron League fighter, and he was one that had dropped bombs on the Tarantula. Horror movies, they were basically in the 1950s were entirely different from everything that preceded them, because the 1950s, they brought in a new world that was completely different than the world that came from before. The planet was still reeling from, all of the losses in World War II. The communism that was responsible for many of the deaths, and then due to nuclear technology, for the first time in history, humans had developed the ability to entirely wipe out humanity. So the anxieties and how this made this such a scary world was reflected in the horror films of the 50s. So definitely the nuclear power destructive force was a new and common motif. In 1947, we had the famous Roswell incident, which UFOs at the time became a national obsession. And they used this to reflect in the endless invading aliens and UFOs into the 1950s horror. This inspired films like Plan 9 from Outer Space with, of course, the greatest shock star, Bela Lugosi. And then, of course, we also had It Came from Outer Space. And how about H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds? And then, of course, another famous one was Invasion of the Body Snatchers. So we had a lot of space, of course, in The Blob. A lot of things that came from space to attack Earth. House on the Haunted Hill gave us promotional gimmicks like Emergo, a skeleton on a string that would sail out over audiences at pivotal moments in the film. Well, that director, William Castle, also brought us the Tingler.
I'm William Castle, and I feel obligated to warn you about the next attraction you will see at this theater. The picture is The Tingler, which I directed. And for the first time in motion picture history, members of the audience, including you, will actually play a part in the picture. You will feel some of the physical reactions, the shocking sensations experienced by the actors on the screen. I guarantee that The Tingler has more shocks per minute than my last film, The House on Haunted Hill. But don't be alarmed. You can protect yourself. When you see the picture, you will be told, and remember the instruction, how you can guard yourself from attack by The Tingler. And now may I show you a few scenes from The Tingler?
This film breaks the fourth wall. It opens the film with an on-screen warning, and this was the first time the director directly talked to the audience. But it became a trademark as Vincent Price continued on to do that. During the film's climax, when the Tingler gets loose during a screening of the 1921 silent film that was showing, the projectionist threw a switch and the motors started buzzing, which caused the audience to jump and scream. Castle would then employ a second gimmick, a sudden stereophonic sound, and then they would turn off the lights and the film itself, and Vincent Price would be heard over the loudspeaker crying out, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Tingler is loose in the theater. Scream for your lives." And then announces that a Patreon has fainted. And when the lights went up in the theater, a real live victim would be carried out on a stretcher. So when the Tingler headed to the U.S. drive-ins, Castle recorded an alternative warning, substituting his voice for Vincent Price. In 1954, we got another classic. That's right, it was a 3D classic with a geologist in the upper reaches of the Amazon who finds a fossilized web hand that suggests an evolutionary link between sea animals and land animals. Well, that went on to give us the Gill Man. That's right, the humanoid Gill Man, the beloved creature from the Black Lagoon. This was the marketing of the first underwater film in 3D. And what was interesting about side notes, like Universal, they used two actors to play the creature, one on land and one in water. And every time the monster would appear, he would have his own theme. What also was unique about the Gill Man, he was almost designed after the Academy Award statue. But the Universal execs, they said that it appeared more feminine than they thought about using. So they thought that maybe if they did do a second film and they had a female creature as a possibility, then they would use that mold. The creature from the Black Lagoon pretty much had a lot of drafts of the script, and they were written and rewritten and by a lot of writers. But pretty much they started out with a Kong connection by confining the action to the Amazon, and then, of course, leaving the creature's fate in the end, just in case there was a sequel. But the final script was reshaped and redirected by Arthur Ross and remained mostly in a situation of scenes and ideas from earlier films, including Kong, The Lost World, It Came from Outer Space, and The Thing from Another World. So that was your creation of the creature from the Black Lagoon. Now, audience back then had never really seen a full-bodied monster costume like this. You had the Wolfman and Frankenstein's monster, and you always knew that there was a man behind the makeup. But the Gill Man, it was pretty much detailed. They made it really believable. It was just really easy to accept for that time. It pretty much was exactly kind of what you would expect, for a man and a fish to kind of look like, and the gills, obviously, they moved when it breathed. So for that time period, he was very unique. So both Tarantula and Revenge of the Creature marks the screen debut of Clint Eastwood. Like I said, Clint Eastwood is uncredited as a lab technician named Jennings early in the story for Revenge of the Creature, talking to the professor, and then is also a pilot who launches a missile, a bomb, at the Tarantula. So the 50s, they pretty much decades of stomping in these films, obviously with like Godzilla, and they pretty much have made their cinematic debut at the start of the 1900s. Monsters, they have captivated audiences for decades, and we've learned a lot from these films and some special effects, that were just amazing for that time. So we're definitely exploring the history of monsters in movies and just covering certain origins, and sometimes we'll pick on maybe a couple films in that particular time period. Obviously the prominence in the mainstream and how we arrived to the MonsterVerse of today. So that's what we're going to be covering every Monday So I appreciate you guys being here, checking it out. It means a lot. Go ahead and leave a comment. What was some of your favorite monster movies in the 50s? And what would you like to see us explore down the road? Take care, guys.